Hey, college football fans, it's Cole Thompson here, and I brought this up, but starting every single Monday, I'm going to do a Mailbag Monday. Answer questions that maybe you have about the 2024 season, things that are going on in the sport that we know and love more than anything else. And the best way for me to grow my audience is to listen to you folks. So real fast, if you're new here, welcome on into the channel. Make sure that you hit subscribe and the ring notification. That way you don't miss a single episode of Just Saying It. Make sure that also you're following me on social media at Mr. Cole Thompson. I'm on every single platform: TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. They're all the exact same name, and it's the exact same as my YouTube handle. The link's right down there below. So go ahead and hit subscribe or follow on both platforms. Tell your friends, family, mortal enemies, best of bros, college football fans in general about this channel, because we're on the race to become the #1 college football community here on YouTube. If I'm the #1 show and I'm able to go toe-to-toe with the big-time platforms, that's awesome, but I'd rather be the #1 college football community. And again, the best way to go ahead and have your questions answered in the mailbag is by either emailing me at colethompsonwriting@gmail.com or sliding in the DMs on Twitter at Mr. Cole Thompson. I'm going to do about 6 questions a day. Maybe what I'll do is I'll break these up into one-off videos as well. That way I get more content out there. But again, if you have a question, I would love to answer it as much as possible. So slide in the DMs, go ahead and email me. A lot of these came through email this time. So the email is probably the best way to reach me, but I'm still going to answer as many questions as possible. First one comes from Martin in Dothan, Alabama. With Nick Saban retired, what takes over as the new biggest rivalry in the SEC? And is it still Alabama, Georgia? For right now, yes, I would say it still is Bama, Georgia, just because of what the animosity between these two programs are. But you got to realize the thing that really stands out about what made this such a unique system was not the fact that these two had a long, rich history of playing against each other in primetime games. It was the coaches. It was the two men who were calling the shots on the sidelines and their history of working together. Because you got to remember that at one point, Alabama kind of fell off the wagon. Gene Stallings leaves. They go through an entire bit of rebuild with the Mikes, with a couple of other coaches that they don't really feel good about. And then they bring in Nick Saban. Well, meanwhile, going on in Athens, Georgia, you have Mark Richt. And Richt is at this point kind of put himself on the forefront of the SEC. It doesn't mean that he's the only name out there, because you still had an Urban Meyer at the time, but he was the guy that was starting to kind of take over as the next up-and-comer. And then Nick Saban comes to town, and Saban takes a year, and he loses to Louisiana Monroe, and he calls it the most embarrassing loss of his entire career. And eventually, now we're starting to see things turn around. They lose to Utah in the Sugar Bowl, but then they win a national championship, and they beat Florida, and they go ahead and they beat up on Texas, and that starts the dynasty. And who is his defense coordinator? It's Kirby Smart. And Kirby, the thing about him that makes this such a unique system is Kirby isn't like Nick Saban. Saban went to Kent State. Saban was a defensive back that kind of played around and went from coaching from the NFL to college to being at Michigan State to LSU and then coming to Alabama. Well, Kirby was Georgia-based, and Kirby was all Georgia from the get-go. And so as he was developing as a coach and as he was turning into the household name that is now leading the charge and probably college football's finest coach right in history, or at least for the time being, he was learning underneath Saban. And he took a little bit of the pages that were the playbook that eventually led to the dynasty in Tuscaloosa and brought it over to Athens. And he started to say, listen, there are some things that we're doing here that are really good, really profitable. It's why we've been able to stay at the forefront of all East conversations. It's why we passed up on Tennessee. It's why we passed up on Florida. But we're still not at that elite level. We're not doing things at the way that Alabama is. And because of it, he learned underneath the greatest. And now he's created a great culture, one that is as sustainable as the one that currently resided in Tuscaloosa for the last 17 years. And I do think that Kalen DeBoer has something to say about this, because he is, in my opinion, one of the best coaches in college football right now. The thing that we have to remember is that even though his time period is very short, it has been very sustainable. Whether it be at Fresno State, whether it be at Washington, his ability to take programs that were in worse situations than most coaches. Like, there's a conversation going around right now. Who would you rather have, Dan Lanning or Kalen DeBoer? Are we talking about for the foreseeable future, or are we talking about just for one season? Because for the long term, yeah, you're probably going with Dan Lanning. He's younger. He's got a little bit more upside. He's got a little bit more connection with recruits. But in terms of program reconstruction, I don't think you're leaning anywhere else but Kalen DeBoer right now because of what he's done at his last 2 previous stops. And again, most programs would probably regress if you didn't have a great head coach that was coming in place of Nick Saban. And there's really not that many that could easily contain the waters. Well, that coach actually ends up being a pretty damn good one because he just led his team to a national championship 2 years after they were the most downtrodden team in the Pac-12 underneath Jimmy Lake. So you feel good about that. I do think that there is a little bit of question when it comes to what happens now, especially at Alabama, because we haven't seen it. I mean, it's a brand new chapter in Tuscaloosa. It's not a new chapter in Athens. We know what to expect from Georgia every single year. They recruit like no one else. They know how to work the transfer portal and bring in players that fit their system and fit their culture. They can pick and choose who they want. And nobody really is going to question what Kirby's doing because of the sustained success. Not just when it being number 1 team in the country, but they've been a top 10 program every year, minus the first season underneath Kirby Smart. Kind of remind you of somebody? That's exactly what happened with Nick Saban when he got to Tuscaloosa. If there was a rivalry that I would say is going to emulate or match this rivalry in the not-so-distant future, I think it's Texas. I do. And it's not because of both these guys are Saban disciples and they revamped their careers and they were able to learn underneath one of the greatest play callers, one of the greatest masterminds, and also program developers when it came to working the recruiting trail. It's because of what is invested in these 2 programs. Georgia has a booster fund and an NIL collective that is laying down on the line saying, okay, what do you need? What do you need to be successful? And we're going to give you whatever it is because we want to contain this type of mentality for every year that we're profitable. And Texas, they've always had the money. They've always had the resources. People think that because Texas fell off the face of the earth for a while, that they were no longer a great team. That's not the case, even slightly. What they had was all the pieces in place to drive a sustainable car, but they just didn't have the right guy behind the wheel. It's like telling like a 10-year-old, hey, go ahead and drive this Lamborghini with a stick shift. Go ahead and figure it out, by the way. Sometimes you have people that know what they're doing, and then other times you don't. And a lot of the problem that was at Texas was they always had everything going their way in terms of recruiting, in terms of NIL funds, or at the point transfer portal, what they were able to pay under the table to get kids in, but they didn't have the right guy behind the wheel. And a lot of people thought, well, Steve Sarkisian after year 1 is not the right guy. No, he was. You just had to give him time. You just had to let him go and develop in who he was. And now it's sustainable. And now Texas is at that same level where they're able to bring in the right recruits. They're able to bring in certain transfers that fit their system. And they're not afraid to swing for the fences in terms of adding in a player that maybe is not up to par of what their standard is, but if they can get them to play up to their standard, really hard not to like what they bring in. So I'm excited to see what the future holds for the rivalries in the SEC. I think a lot like Texas, Alabama and Georgia. These are going to be 2 teams that don't play each other on the regular, but you are going to see them this upcoming season. It's going to be in Austin. It's going to be one of the biggest games in college football this year. It's going to be a matchup that many people are going to be focused in on because of this could control the pathway to Atlanta for one of these teams and almost guarantee them in a college football playoff spot. I do think Alabama, Georgia still right now holds the crown simply because of what is the Southeastern Conference. But don't be surprised if Texas starts moving in place of Alabama in the not-so-distant future. Georgia's got the sustainability. Texas has the sustainability. They're both big brands, and they both have coaches that seem like they're very content staying where they are. Now it's about learning how to build off of everything that they currently have in their system and how to continue just to make it where they don't have any question marks. Next question. Greg in Chicago. Who is one team not being talked about enough when it comes to being a potential sleeper in 2024? Let me ask you guys something. Do you know who is the number 1 team in returning production this year? Can anybody tell me? Anybody? Well, it's Iowa State, but the team that I'm actually going to be speaking of is the one that currently had the most returning production before the second wave of the transfer portal. That's Virginia Tech. I'm not sure how many people are watching this video that are under the age of maybe like 22, but there was a point in time where there was a coach by the name of Frank Beamer. You maybe heard of his son. He's currently working at South Carolina right now, where he led Virginia Tech to sheer dominance. They were one of the most complete teams in college football every single year. They were great defensively. They had one of the best coordinators in Bud Foster. They were a fantastic program when it came to recruiting. And even though they weren't at a major program and they weren't a major conference, they always put up major numbers in games. They went to a national championship with Michael Vick as their starting quarterback. They were always finding themselves inside the top 10 rankings. And this was a program that when you look at how they played, people feared them. They didn't care about what conference they were in or what they did the year prior. They just knew that on Saturdays, and we walked into Blacksburg, Virginia, we walked into that stadium and we heard Enter Sandman. It was going to be crazy. It was never going to be just a normal game. And for a while, we finally saw it as the Justin Fuente era didn't really go according to plan. And then we saw Brent Pry in year one kind of struggle. Well, now he's built something that is very much sustainable and what really could be an intriguing team going into 2024. 84% of the production returns this upcoming season. They bring back their starting quarterback and Kyron Drones, one of the more underrated quarterbacks in all of college football this year. They also bring back their number one wide receiver. They bring back a ton of defensive talent. I think it's like 85%, if I'm not mistaken, of defensive talent going into this year. They also have a very manageable schedule. Not saying that you're not going to see some losses on there, but Vanderbilt, Marshall, Old Dominion to begin the year. Rutgers, Miami, Stanford. You feel good, I think, about two of those three matchups. Boston College, Georgia Tech, Syracuse, Clemson, Duke, Virginia to close it out. I'm not saying that when you look at Virginia Tech, they should be a playoff contender. I'm not saying that they should be an ACC contender. But we've seen before, look at Missouri last year. This is a perfect example. Missouri last season went on a tyrant raid because of how much returning production they had. I think it was like 82% of their team came back for 2023. And they went and they won the Cotton Bowl and they held their own against Georgia. And now we talk about Missouri as a team that probably should make the college football playoff. They should be a team with their schedule, with what returns this year, headlined by Brady Cook, Luther Burden, Theo Wees, what they have in terms of Kirby Moore back. You feel good about where Missouri is. Well, maybe that's Virginia Tech this year. They're the team that isn't ready to go ahead and be a playoff contender, especially in even a 12-team playoff where Missouri would have gone last year. But they are a team that does feel like it's over the hump. Now we're talking about 9 wins. Now we're talking about potentially 10-win seasons. Now we're talking about them being alongside the Clemsons of the world, the Florida States, the Miamis, even the NC States. And they can be a roster, a program that not only holds their own in games, but you see those matchups that were one-possession games and they fall apart in the fourth quarter. Well, it flips, and now instead, they're the ones closing out on top. They're the ones that currently are finding ways to keep this momentum going. They're the ones that now are saying, we're going to go 9-3. We're going to go 10-2. We're going to be in that hunt. And it's not that far-fetched. Brent Pry's a really good coach, and he's waited for this moment to finally arise. You ask anybody around State College at Penn State, they'll tell you how much they loved what a guy like Brent Pry did for this team and how he was waiting adamantly for his right job. He got the right job in Blacksburg. And I can tell you this much. If you are young enough and don't know what a Saturday night in Blacksburg looks like when this place is roaring and they actually are really good, I don't know what to tell you. Because if you know that when you look at what this team does when they're 6-7, they still sell out the arena and the atmosphere. When you hear that, it's just fantastic. It's why you talk about one of the greatest traditions in college football. Enter Sandman has to be at the very top of it. And so I look at this team and I say to myself, if they can be like Missouri in 2023, this is going to be a very intriguing roster moving forward. They have the talent. And I do think that when you look at this team, maybe they won't be the reason why you're going to the college football playoff, but they'll be damn sure a reason why a team isn't going to the college football playoff. Next question comes from Zach in Gainesville. What are your thoughts on the recent move of Florida in the transfer portal? Is Billy Napier still on the hot seat? Well, the Billy Napier on the hot seat conversation is really interesting to me because I personally just don't entirely understand it, especially going into this season. Now, I understand that Florida fans are very frustrated with what's been going on over the last 2 years. You watched regression set in last season. You bring in a brand new quarterback in Graham Mertz. You feel good about him and his progression, but the defense takes a step back. The defensive line is completely awful when it comes to run support. They don't really play up to the certain standard that we know about Florida. And so a lot of people are saying this is a crucial year for Billy Napier going into the 2024 season. It's his third season in the SEC. He's a former Saban disciple. He had success at Louisiana. Is he just going to be G5 Billy moving forward? Well, the recent moves in the transfer portal were really, really promising. They brought in Cormani McClain. He's going to be a walk-on this year. They also bring over Elijah Badger, who was a phenomenal wide receiver coming out of Arizona State. It's kind of funny how you get another Arizona State wide receiver like Ricky Pearsall a few years ago. But they have some players that are going to be really, really promising. They get the four-star former freshman that was at USC, Jason Zalamia, I think is how you say his last name. He's going to be potentially a plug-and-play starter at your interior guard position. They also still have Trey Wilson. They also still have 4 running backs that are really promising, headlined by Montreal Johnson. They still have the quarterback, and they also brought in Chimere Dike from Wisconsin that played with Graham Mertz. The thing about Florida is, and I don't want to go ahead and give them a benefit of the doubt because if I'm not one of those people, I don't believe that you are what your record says you are. I know Josh Pate says that a lot, and so I'm not going to lie and say I didn't steal that from him. But I will say, when you talk about Florida, this is one of those years where you have to go ahead and look at the record and kind of throw it out the window. They have a schedule from hell. They have a schedule that I don't even think Satan of college football himself could have came up with and said, yeah, I'm that statistically evil. I'm that high pitch of a terrible human being. Have you seen the back end of their schedule? Like, everyone wants to talk about what happens when you come to the front end. We're just talking about how they're going to set the tone going into 2024. Have you seen how it closes out? I mean, yeah, Miami week 1 is going to be a bloodbath. Then, of course, you have the UCF game, but it's at home. After your bye against Kentucky, you play Georgia at a neutral site location, at Texas, LSU, Ole Miss, Florida State. Find a win there. Find the win in one of those games. Because I can tell you right now, Texas, they're going to be playoff bound, or at least they think that they are. Ole Miss, they feel like a team that's playoff bound. Florida State, they're not going to take a step back. Yeah, they lost a lot of talent offensively. They're still portaling like no one's business. They're a really good team. Florida has the 5th-ranked transfer portal class of 2024. Just hear that for a second. You talk about the teams that were better than them. Texas A&M, Oregon, Ole Miss were the 3 other ones you throw in there. I think Texas was also like number 4, if I'm not mistaken. But 3 of those teams are playoff teams. And Florida, they're 5th. They have talent. They have a team that's really going to be put together in time. I don't think that Florida right now you can go ahead and say, well, if they don't get to 9 wins, then Billy Napier's not the right coach. What defines success for this team is not based off of wins and losses. What defines success for this team, this specific Florida team, is all about progress. Are you finishing drives? Are you able to close out games when you have leads? Are you able to not make mental mistakes on special teams like you did in week 1 against Utah? Because you could have beaten Utah in Rice-Eccles Stadium because they didn't have they didn't have their quarterback, they didn't have their star tight end, they lost a ton of talent. You could have beat Utah that season once again, like you did back in Gainesville, but that didn't happen because you had too many mental mistakes. Can you have that? That's progress. This is a year 3 program. What you're trying to say to yourself is that finally, this is a team that is well equipped, well put together, and is not going to crumble underneath its own pressure. To me, when you look at Florida, they can still be a really good program. The way that they're coached, the way that you've seen Billy Napier make changes in the offseason, whether it be at defensive line, whether it be at linebackers coach, the way that he's been about trying to make sure that this team has no questions going into the year, that's a sign that you are watching adaptability. Eli Drinkwitz went through this a few years ago. Like he said, I have to give up the play calling if I want to keep my job. And what happened? Well, they won a Cotton Bowl, and now you have the head coach in waiting in Kirby Moore, and Drink got a brand new contract. And I'm not saying that that's going to happen with Florida, but if they get to 7 wins this year, 7 wins for most people with this schedule would be like 10 wins for other teams. It's why we say whenever you look at conferences and you look at matchups, not every 9-win team, not every 10-win team is the exact same because it's false. It is. It's a false narrative. There's no way that you're taking a MAC team that's 10-2 and putting them against a 9-3 Florida team and saying, oh, they're the same. No, they're not. They're nowhere near the same in terms of consistency, in terms of play style. So you can't take that and put these two together. They have a good balanced roster. Now it's about capitalizing, showing that there is consistency, and finding ways to have these toss-up matchups between like a Texas A&M, like a UCF, maybe even a Miami, and closing out with the win. That's how you look at this roster and say, that's progress for 2024. I don't think when you look at this team and say, oh, they have to go X amount of wins, that's showing that Billy Napier's safe. If that's the way that they want to do it, then Scott Strickland also should probably be out of a job, because if he realized this schedule is absolutely asininely insane. But if you don't do it that way, then that's on you. Nothing else to say about that. Let's go to the next question. Bet your life on the line. Who is one team you're confident in making the college football playoff for the first time outside of the usual suspects? Jeff in San Diego. This is a really good question because there's a lot of teams. I'm thinking when you say usual suspects, you mean Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, Michigan, the ones that have been in over the last few years. I think Ole Miss has to be the team. And let me explain why. Ole Miss this past offseason absolutely crushed the transfer portal once again. They have the number one portal class in the country. That's not a shocker, knowing what Lane Kiffin's done. But do you know the enigma that was around this team last year? They go 11-2. It's the best winning season in program history. They've never had 11 wins, ever. That's a brand new thing for Ole Miss. And you watch this team, and slowly you're seeing, well, what if we just would have won against Georgia? Well, what if we just would have beaten Alabama? Well, we would have been in the playoff this past year. And we have some talent that we know is still got a few more years of eligibility. Let's go ahead and embrace it, and let's come back. You hear Jackson Dart, I'm coming back for the last dance. And then you get Jordan Watkins to commit. And then Trey Harris, the transfer from Louisiana Tech, comes back. And Caden Prieskorn signs up for it. And then you start to see the defensive players come back. Jared Ivory says, I want to be here. JJ Pegas says, I want to be here. And Lane Kiffin now realizes, well, all these players are coming back for another year. I got to make sure that I build this roster so well equipped that there are going to be no question marks. And what's he do? Well, he builds up that defensive line with Princely Uwin-Manliellen from Florida and Walter Nolan from Texas A&M. He gets a really good linebacker that a lot of people in the country are going to find out about, Chris Paul, who was great last season at Arkansas, but he played for an Arkansas team that was vastly underappreciated because of what their record said. He goes and he builds up the offensive line, gets a couple of players from group of five schools, but they are really talented. They have multiple years of starting experience. He replaces the running back production with four different guys, whether it be the kid from New Mexico, whether it be Henry Parrish coming back from Miami. They just got Amos, Rashad Amos from Miami of Ohio, who was at Mississippi State, and then he went to Colorado, and now he's at Ole Miss. He did a lot of transfers. That's a whole different story for another day. They also bring in Juice Walls from South Carolina. There's no question anymore about Ole Miss. And now it turns to, well, is it just making the college football playoff enough for us? Is it just getting into the dozen dance? Is that enough for us to feel content? I don't think so anymore, because you look at the schedule, it's very much boding well in their favor to be able to hold their own in every single game. Find 3 guaranteed losses on the schedule. You can't. Because if you can say, well, if you go to LSU and they have a sustainable defense, well, maybe that's a loss. And then you say, well, if Oklahoma's offense is able to pick up the pace and they're really, really good by the time that they come into Oxford, well, that's a loss. But if it is in Norman, it maybe is 100% a loss. You find one guaranteed loss, and even then you feel, well, maybe because of what we added in with the defensive line, with new players and guys that still are here, well, maybe we can hold our own against Georgia this year, because the one thing that hurt us was not having a great defensive line. That's not a problem anymore. We have a great front seven. We have sustainability and consistency with Pete Golding going into year 2. We feel really good about where we are as a program heading into the season. So I think that when you look at Ole Miss, their schedule is extremely potent. They also have the returning production. I think Jackson Dart's a Heisman favorite. I think he should be. I think many people are sleeping on him. FanDuel has them with the 8th best odds to win the national championship. Just humor yourself with that for a second. It's Ole Miss. This is a team that's never been to Atlanta, to a conference championship. Yet here they are in the hunt to make it to the college football playoff, and probably a favorite to where you want to put them in permanent marker. They're going to be in one of those 12 spots. Do you feel that way about Texas? You feel that way about LSU? You feel that way about maybe like a Michigan, or if you go to the ACC, Miami, maybe you say that about a Florida State? No, there's questions with those teams. Now, I think Texas is pretty dang close, but I think that when you look at Ole Miss, Every box that they needed to have checked off was accomplished this offseason. And so now you're not just hoping that you make it to the college football playoff, you're expecting it. And you're also expecting to win a game or two. You're expecting to be in the quarterfinals with what returns on this offense and what returns because of their buying in. It's the last dance. We know that after this season, it may be south for a little while. We know that we may not be back here. So let's go ahead and embrace everything that we can and just push all of our chips into the pile. We're all in. It's blackjack and we're holding double aces. Let's hope that the river floats our way and that we're able to go ahead and come out on top. Next question. Who has changed your opinion in the projected win total since the end of spring football? Jacob in Athens. There's two teams I want to bring up real fast. Auburn's number one. I'm not ready to go ahead and say that Peyton Thorne has to be literally his version of 2021 to be able to go ahead and make Auburn a 9+ win team. But it feels like that's going to have to be the case, or you're going to have to rely really heavily on this freshman class. But you look at what they brought in. Cam Coleman is probably going to be the first wide receiver that flirts with 1,000 yards since Y2K on the Plains. That's going to happen. But the thing that's going to make this offense open up a lot more is they brought in Keandre Lambert-Smith from Penn State. That's a really good complementary piece. And now you have two weapons on top of Fairweather as your tight end to where you feel really good about this team. Defensively, they brought in some players. Isaiah Rakes, who was at Texas A&M, then he was at USC. Now he's down in Auburn. I think that he's going to be a really good fit for this defense. He already has a relationship with DJ Durkin, who just got hired in place of, why am I blanking on his name? Forget it. He's not important, I guess, right now. But Auburn, they have talent. They have a really good recruiting class. They did a great job of flipping 3 players on National Signing Day or early signing day, whatever you want to call that new period. And they finished with a top 10 class. Hugh Freeze is the right guy to lead this team. I have no question about that. I think that when I look at this Auburn program, a lot of those games that were toss-ups to where it's like, well, maybe they will hold their own against Texas A&M. Well, maybe they'll be okay when they play against Alabama. Well, maybe there'll be some things that go right for them when they play against, let's just go with, when they play Cal. Now it kind of feels like, all right, well, maybe they're a team that does feel like they're trending upward. Their schedule, they should start off the year 4-0. Alabama A&M, Cal, New Mexico, Arkansas. And all those games are also at Jordan-Hare Stadium. So the thing about that is, if you're relying heavily on this newcomers, these freshmen that are supposed to be this wave that really sets the tone in Auburn, you're getting them in a really good, comfortable spot. Because then they have to go ahead and they have to welcome in Oklahoma. And that's going to be a big test. But then you get to go on the road, back-to-back games against 2 potential playoff teams in Georgia and Missouri. Then you play Kentucky after a bye. So you feel a little bit different about that roster. I still think that Auburn feels like that 8-win team. They're going to be better than what they were last year. But I could see them flirting around and getting to 9-3. And if they do start to hit their stride and this offense picks up a lot, it's going to be really hard for me not to say that Auburn is at least flirting with 10 wins. Going into the Iron Bowl this year, that's a very big trap game, I think, for Alabama because they're traveling to Norman the week before. And that's going to be Kalen DeBoer's first Iron Bowl in Bryant-Denny Stadium. Weird stuff happens at Auburn. We've all known this for a while. But you want to set the tone in year one at Alabama. And for me, that might be where you fall apart against Oklahoma. And maybe that's where you don't end up seeing your fruits of your labor work. The other team, UCF. The Big 12 is weird. I brought this up many a time. The Big 12 is the best conference in college football. It top to bottom is fantastic. Everyone knows that the Big 12 is just a complete chaotic mess that is always going to be exciting because there's like 11 teams with odds that can make the college football playoff and win. Iowa State, West Virginia, Utah, Oklahoma State, Kansas State, they're all really good. And UCF last season didn't really hit their stride the way that we thought that maybe they would underneath Gus Malzahn. So what do? They go to the transfer portal and they upgrade at certain positions. There is no Cam Newton 2.0. Let's just get this out of the way. There are certain players in college football that we respect based off of what they did during their time in college that we just go ahead and say, you are one of one. But if there is a quarterback that does emulate what Cam Newton did best and is going to be working with the guy that turned Cam Newton into a number 1 overall pick, it's KJ Jefferson. He didn't go pro. No, he still is in college for what feels like the 17,000th year. It really does. The thing about him is that he's going to be working with the same guy that developed Cam. And he's also going to have a better offensive line than what he had at Arkansas. He's going to be playing against lesser competition in the Big 12, or at least in terms of the quality of players that usually you see on Saturdays in that conference. They also added in another really good running back in Penny Boone. Penny Boone last year at Toledo was phenomenal. One of the best running backs in the MAC. He was a big reason why the Rockets went 11-1 during the regular season. They also bring over Jacoby Jones at wide receiver, a really good complimentary number 2 target. And they still have RJ Harvey on this team. RJ Harvey was one of the more slept on running backs in college football last year. He went over 1,000 yards. He was really consistent on moving the sticks. He had a great game against Oklahoma State. Their schedule is really challenging, especially on the back end. Like, you look at where UCF is going into the season. There's going to be some questions. They're going to start off, I think, really fast. New Hampshire, TCU, Sam Houston, Colorado. I would not be shocked. They travel to Gainesville still undefeated. But then they close out the year with Arizona, Arizona State, West Virginia on the road, and Utah. Every one of those games I think could be a toss-up. But I'm starting to feel a little bit more confident in saying, well, I think this is a 7-win team. No, I actually think it's about an 8-win team. Well, actually, I think that they could get to 9 wins. Well, 10 wins is not entirely off the table. I think it's still far-fetched to say that they're going to be a favorite to make it to the college football playoff and win the Big 12. And right now, I don't think that you're going to see a team outside of the conference champion from the Big 12 go to the postseason unless a bunch of other weird things happen. But I will say, do not be shocked if we're talking about early November, that matchup against West Virginia, that having Big 12 playoff implications. That matchup against Arizona having Big 12 playoff implications. That Utah matchup, maybe it's going to be a preview of what we see in Arlington a week from now when the two meet up again. And maybe they'll learn something in the process to where they will get into the college football playoff. I'm not entirely counting out the Knights. They did a great job in the second wave of the portal. I feel very confident in this team. And lastly, this comes from Owen in Milwaukee. Could a 9-3 team make the college football playoff in 2024? And if so, who are the favorites? If a 9-3 team makes the college football playoff, it's going to come from one of two conferences. You're not going to get it from the ACC. You're not going to get it from the Group of 5 school unless literally every single Group of 5 team is 9-3. And you're not going to get it from the Big 12. So it's going to come from the SEC and it's going to come from the Big 10. I think that the big brand names are also going to get a little bit more psych over everyone else. So what that means is that if you're like a Mississippi State and you have an incredible first year underneath Jeff Levy, Blake Shapen is the truth. You like your offense. You get a little bit of that Dan Mullen consistency on defense, like from the years past where they were always great in being able to set the tone. Like, yeah, at that point, you feel good about the direction of Mississippi State. They're not getting a pass. Alabama might get the pass. And there's a shot where they do go 9-3, but yet still, because of what they have and their background and the regencies and what is kind of recency bias, they would get in. I think the same thing about Michigan. Michigan, we are not talking enough about them this year because we just talk about what happened last season when they lost everybody. Yeah, they lose Jim Harbaugh. Yeah, they lose JJ McCarthy. Yes, they lose Blake Corum. Yes, they lose a lot of defensive players. You do realize that this is still almost the exact same staff. Like Sharon Moore came in, took over for 3 games, won 3 prominent games that you did not expect to happen for an interim coach. And yet here they are with the same staff. Literally, there was no turnaround. Yeah, you added in a few new pieces because Jesse Minter left and Harbaugh left, so you had to go ahead and promote an offensive line coach, and you bring in Wink Martindale. But it's still the same system. It's still the same aura. This is still the same team in terms of what is the identity of Michigan. And their games are going to be close. Texas in week 2. That's going to be a close call. You also have Ohio State. So you know that right now this could be potentially a 9-3 team if Alex Orji doesn't live up to the standard. They don't get that number 1 wide receiver. Though they did do a really good job in this last wave of the transfer portal. Like, did you see what they did recently? They were portaling like a legit team that knows they're not going to drop off. But if they were 9-3, maybe you would give them the benefit of the doubt. The same thing goes for Oregon. The same thing goes for Ohio State, even though I don't think Ohio State at 9-3 would get in simply because of what the expectations were. Same thing for Georgia. Like the 9-3 teams, the way that I would compare it, who did they lose to? How did they lose those games? And what about the other major contenders in college football? So like a 9-3 Notre Dame team will not get into the playoff because they're an independent. But what would you say if it was a 9-3 Tennessee and it was a 10-2 Florida State? Well, maybe you would give Florida State the nod because last season They went undefeated. They held their own against everybody. They did their job. And yet still, Boo Corrigan said they weren't going to be bent over a barrel, and they absolutely were. Well, maybe now you feel like, no, you have to put them in because if they have a better record than what the team is in the SEC, they held their own against other opponents, and the games that they lost, maybe they only lost by one possession. And maybe Tennessee got blown out by NC State by 20 points in week 2, or maybe they lost by 25 points in Norman with Josh Heupel returning. And that's the difference in this. So I do think that what's going to happen is you're going to see at least one 9-3 team flirt with the opportunity to be in the playoff. And it will come from the SEC and it will come from the Big Ten. But then you have to look at the other programs in college football, how they won their games, how you lost your games. And then from there, you'll have that conversation. I'm not saying it's impossible. What I am saying is I don't think you'll get the benefit of the doubt if you are a small team. If you're, say, a South Carolina, or let's say you're a Michigan State, you're going to have to go 10-2, 11-1 to get to the CFP. But if you're Michigan, if you're Alabama, if you're Oregon, if you're Georgia, you'll probably get the benefit of the doubt because of where your roster is, the bourgeoisie of your program, the abundance of what the ratings will say to be able to sneak your way in as an 11 seed. If it's not one of those programs, unfortunately, I just don't think that it's going to be possible. That's going to do it for this mailbag edition of Just Saying It. If you have questions, go ahead and email me, ColeThompsonWriting@gmail.com. Every single Monday, I'm going to start doing this. Make sure also that you hit subscribe. That way we continue to have conversations surrounding our favorite sport. Make sure also you're following me on all the social media platforms, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, at Mr. Cole Thompson. It's the exact same as my YouTube channel. So go ahead and hit subscribe here, hit follow over there. Make sure that also you're keeping up with everything that we're doing because we're talking college football leading up to week 1. So tell friends, family, mortal enemies, best of bros, really anybody that just enjoys sports conversation in general. Love doing this type of content. And until next time, folks, I am Cole Thompson. Later.